Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another installment in the Evening Conversation series from the Connecticut Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House. My name is Allie Keif, and I am a museum educator at the Connecticut Democracy Center and will be hosting tonight's program. We are the place where history and civics meet, and our goal is to share stories and ideas that help people understand our state and ways to make it better. I'm so lucky to be joined tonight by Dennis Culliton, Executive Director of the Witness Stones Project, and Kaitlyn Oberndorfer, a graduate student working with the project. The Witness Stones Project partners with local schools and historical societies to assist students in researching the history of an enslaved individual from their community and reconstructing the memory of that person through the written record. Ultimately, the students, along with the community, install a commemorative witness stone. Dennis Culliton is the founder and executive director of the Witness Stones Project. He served in the Marines before attending college at University of Massachusetts, receiving degrees in anthropology and economics. After a decade working for the federal government, he went on to Quinnipiac University, graduating with a master's in teaching and history. While in his third decade of teaching, he started the Witness Stones Project with his students in Guilford. To date, the project has spread to over a dozen communities in 3 northeastern states, reaching more than 2,000 students. Besides this project, Dennis is devoted to his wife of 42 years, his 3 adult children, and his granddaughter, Frankie. Kaitlyn Oberndorfer is a current intern for the Witness Stones Project through the Public History Master's Program at Central Connecticut State University. In addition to her position as a historical interpreter for the Mark Twain House and Museum, Kaitlyn is an educator for CREC Greater Hartford Academy of the Arts High School. There, she exclusively teaches 11th and 12th grade American history and hopes to bring the Witness Stones Project to her program and district for the upcoming 2021-2022 school year. Tonight, Dennis and Kaitlyn will share the history of the Witness Stones Project and information about the development of Witness Stones in Hartford with local students. We hope that this will be an interactive program, so please post questions in the comments section, and we will share them with the speakers towards the end of the program. Welcome to Dennis and Kaitlyn. We're so glad to have you here this evening.
Okay, thank you very much, Allison. And it's so nice to be here. The Old State House, Connecticut's Old State House has been a big part of Connecticut history and teaching students. I know my students who have gone through the History Day programs have really appreciated it. So today we're learning about the Witness Stones Project, learning and teaching the hard history of slavery in the North. Before I get started with that, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement. Hartford stands on Wangunk land. I'd like to acknowledge our neighboring indigenous nations, the Mohegans and Nipmunks to the east, the Podunk and Tunxus to the north, the Wappinger, Pagusset, and Mohican to the west, and the Quinnipiac to the south. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. When we talk about New England, when we talk about our Connecticut's history, we really have to think about what is our reason. What was the reason for settlement? Well, we have these wonderful stories about religious freedom and persecution, but then some of our communities were called plantations, and that the people with the most property were the greatest investors into those plantations. So we know if we had subsistence farming on the first day of the first year, the first decade of living in Connecticut, we know that by the second or third decade, we were filling vessels, first with furs and then later on with products to send to Europe, but also the West Indies, and then later on the American South. So our reason for being here has to do with slavery, and we know our friends who wrote the book, Complicity, Ann Farrow, Joe Lang, and Jennifer Frank, tell that wonderful story, or wonderfully sad story, about how Connecticut promoted, prolonged, and profited from slavery. The more we look at the records, the more we unpack, we understand that story is why we have these big houses around our greens, why we're still an affluent state, and maybe even why we have one of the highest vaccination rates right now, because it has to do with our affluence and historic affluence, and even today. Another interesting book written about a similar place is about Shelter Island, right off the coast of Connecticut, between the forks of Long Island. And there's an interesting book written by Catherine Howlett Hayes about it's called Slavery Before Race, but it really talks about plantations at the Sylvester Manor and how people working in Long Island had a partner. There was a brother who was in Long Island, another brother who was in Barbados, and they were shipping stuff to each other. So clearly part of this West India trade. And just recently, Christy Clark Pajara wrote a wonderful book about Rhode Island and slavery, and not just talking about the slavery from Bristol, the ships going to Africa to bring slaves to the West Indies into the 13 colonies, but also how Rhode Island was a plantation to feed and clothe and provide lumber and horses and things like that to the West Indies. Local evidence of the West India trade. We can find at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center, it's sundry advancements on the sloop Juno. So it looks like a fellow named Eli Foote, some of you might know him as Harriet Beecher Stowe's grandfather, was filling ships in Guilford and sending them to the West Indies. And some of the things that were on the ship were 700 pounds of beef and tallow. These are individual line items, not totals. Bushels of corn and oats. 4,600 red oak barrel staves. So think about all that sugar and molasses. How are you going to get it north? Well, you needed to make barrels. So I'm sure they had coopers and more coopers down there to use these barrel staves. Pressed hay, horses, oxen, and culling staves. So we have a whole list. And on this list, we can see names of individuals, which is kind of neat. So somebody might send, Simeon Chittenden might send a pair of oxen, hoping that Eli Foote could sell them and give him money, but also he would make a profit from the sale. But today, so that was part of what was going on. But we do know there was enslaved people here. So not only were we benefiting from slavery in the West Indies, but we were benefiting from slavery here. And how do we remember those formerly enslaved? Well, we have examples, grave marker here for Shem in the old North Guilford Cemetery across from the North Guilford Congregational Church. There are only 2 stones that are left from the time of slavery that are for enslaved people, and we have both of them are for someone named Shem, and we believe both Shems were soldiers. One fought in the American Revolution, and one may have fought in the French and Indian War. Over here to the right, we have grave markers for Candace Bush and Hester Mead. Candace Bush was held in captivity at what is now the Bush Holly House by David Bush, and her daughter Hester Mead was born after 1784, so she was enslaved, but only till she reached an age, I think, of 21 years old by the time she was born. Well, Hester bought a stone for herself and at the same time for her mother. So these are 2 of the few markers we have in Connecticut for people who were enslaved. And then we know, and let's see if this trick works, but I'm going to click on this, and we know at the ancient burial ground in Hartford, recently a marker was put up at the by students and other members of at the ancient burial ground about the African Americans, including the African American governors who are buried there. So we have some examples of it, but we'll just say it's few and far between. So let me just get back to that. Sorry. And then some other examples we have are place names. Sometimes we change the name of something because it's not appropriate. But in Guilford and on North Street, west of the Church Street, was called the N-word Lane. The sad thing now is we don't remember African Americans lived there. So now we call it North Street, but maybe it would have been better to give it a name. Like the next example is in Milford. There's a pond that used to be called Niggs Pond, is now called Walker Pond. Well, Reverend Walker was the first African-American minister in Milford. So I like better what Milford did. So at least now we remember that African-Americans swam at that particular pond in that part of, let me think of it, it's on the east side of Milford. And then in Brantford, there was these rocks off the coast, and if you're a sailor, you probably saw it on your map. It said they were called Negro heads, or maybe even a different, maybe the N-word heads. And now they've recently been renamed Soig Rock after a local sachem that lived in what is now Brantford. So they've tried to at least remember that people of color were in that neighborhood or that vicinity. So we could see there's ways that we can remember, and there's ways that we disremember who was living here before. How do we remember? Well, we have stories, and in Greenwich, we have this book. Jeffrey Mead wrote this book, Chains Unbound. He went into the property records in Greenwich and pulled out every single emancipation he could find. It is a treasure trove, and you can also find this information online. And we are using that right now with 2 schools. We're working with Greenwich, and we're working with the Greenwich Historical Society, great partners of the Witness Stones Project, to expand, because there were 15 enslaved people who were held in captivity at the Bush Hawley House. They have an area that they designate as a slave quarters, which is one of the few in New England, and they're hoping to put, we're aiming to put 4 Witness Stones memorials in the ground this year, and over time put 15 memorials in the ground to represent all of the people and remember all the people who lived at that site who were held in captivity. Other places we find information, I have Lyman Beecher's autobiography. His autobiography was one of the first places I found enslaved people in Guilford. Lyman Beecher, Harriet's father, Harriet Beecher Stowe's father, lived in North Guilford, and he writes about slavery here. And then we have other books that would be anecdotes. I'm sure in Hartford there's as many books or more of people writing things. Sometimes you find them in family remembrances. Sometimes you find them in books of anecdotes. But more often we find them in property records, probate inventories or wills, autobiographies. Our friends of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, they have digitized much of the town records and the probate records in Connecticut, so you can go on through the Ancestry.com and find town vital records, church records at Ancestry.com, census data, and sometimes we create items for, so I've gone through a book called Burgess Bill of Mortality and see if it comes up, and maybe it won't come up. So we're not gonna try it. Oh, here it is. And what I've done is I've gone through this book where this man, Mr. Burgess, and another person wrote down over 100-year period every single person who died in Guilford and what is now Madison that they had records of. And what I did is I extracted out all the people of color, so you can begin to see the first people that are listed here are Indians. And you can even see some sad stories that Will Redhead's son died, and then another child soon after, a year later, burned to death, and then just a week later, Will Redhead himself drowned in West Pond. There are stories here to be told, and certainly sad stories. One of the things that my students were shocked at is if you look at these records, that oftentimes it's people of color, and I designated different colors using the term that was used by the people writing this information down, that oftentimes we don't find names associated with the enslaved person. So instead of talking about a person who lived next door and writing down their name, we write down the name of the enslaver. So that's the way records were kept in those days. So many of the enslaved people, probably the majority of enslaved people in Connecticut, will never know what their names were. Or many details about them, because some of the records that we have just don't give us names. Negro child, Negro boy, Negro child, Indian girl, Negro man. Sometimes it'll say Negro wench or something like that. So that's something I think it really strikes the children, the students. I say children, but many of them are, teenagers and stuff. When they look at that and realize that people didn't even bother to write down other folks' names. And there's interesting places you want to find information about Connecticut enslaved people who sided with the British during the Revolutionary War. There's this book called the Nova Scotia Book of Negroes that lists all the free and enslaved blacks who joined the British and leaving the 13 colonies and going up to Nova Scotia. And we can see, again, these are church records. We can see the one on the right is from, you can see Cull Jr. Married Dinah, and these were, their last name was Bush. And then we can see David Bush here on the right has Negroes, Phyllis, Millie, Patience, Lucy, Nancy, in Cull. So we could see a long list of people that were owned by, and Hester we also have in Jack. So by David Bush, we can see a long list. These people, because these enslaved people, because they had a last name or were given the last name Bush, show up in the vital records here. If you want to look at the vital records or church records for enslaved people, oftentimes a more productive place is you go to the very end of the book where it says no surname, and you can see here names like Pink and Pomp and Reuben and Rose and Sarah and Stephen and Stepna and Stilly and Sybil. So we can see names because they don't have a last name. That kind of pre-sorts the enslaved people there. And then we can see censuses from different times. I'm going to speed up just a little bit, but this is a colonial census of Connecticut. We could see total Indians and Negroes of 1782 is 6,273. And that's not, I'll say it is mostly Africans in that list. We can see this is Hartford in 1774. This is the last colonial census. In Hartford, if we look across, there were 150, it says total blacks, that's in Indians and African American, but only 5 of those people are Indian. So we can see this little grouping of here is the Indians that are left in Connecticut at the time, or at least left to be counted. And these are the people of color. And you'll notice there's not a community that doesn't have a person, an enslaved person. So here, Hartford City, 5 Indians, 145 Negroes, and almost 5,000 whites is what we have in that number. This goes very well with this idea that 3% of the population was African during the time of slavery. And this number kind of holds up for a long time, all the way through, probably till about 1800, when slavery was really going away. And I'm going to hand this over to Kaitlyn. Kaitlyn, here we go.
Awesome. That's a hard act to follow there, Dennis. Geez, I wish I went first next time. In case you don't remember, I'm a Central Connecticut State University Public History Master's student. I'm interning with Dennis as a requirement of my program, but it also makes me a better teacher because I work at Greater Hartford Academy of the Arts High School. Bottom right-hand picture of you there, you can see where we're stationed out of. We're stationed out of Coltsville, which is a treat because I teach American history 11th and 12th grade. So when you talk about local history connections between this project and our location, I'm a very lucky teacher. I want to thank Allie and Sally Whipple, Old State House in general, for letting us talk tonight. And of course, Dennis, who has been really kind and just letting me intern for him. I've learned a lot. And in working for Dennis, I've additionally, over the past 3 months, really gotten this invaluable insight over and respect of what it means to be an educator, to work alongside this project. And Dennis is going to talk, later on in this program about how each of these programs is specialized to the community that it works with. So in addition to getting to understand what it's like to be that collaborating educator, I also have gotten to see just a smidgen of the intense legwork that it takes to make these projects a reality, to make history, tangible for our students, and to humanize the lives of the enslaved. So it really shines a light on a history that until very recently in the historical record, as Dennis was talking about at the beginning of the program, has been grossly overlooked or generalized in favor of kind of this misnomer that slavery only existed in the American South, which, if you saw, Dennis's intro, that's really not the case. So my task in this internship was to take on kind of a Dennis-like role and try to design and bring this program to my school, Greater Hartford Academy of the Arts. And in doing so, try to illuminate the specifics of Hartford slavery through the eyes of the enslaved. So in these programs, we, narrowed down 1 or 2 candidates for our students to research and allow them, again, to get a more personal sense of what this history looks like rather than this larger, gross generalization. And Dennis will get into this later on in the program, that this entails having the kids look over an extensive body of primary and secondary source records catered to the lives of the enslaved that we're studying, just in the list that Dennis gave you guys, and essentially analyzing and breaking those down in small groups according to 5 separate themes that Dennis and the Witness Stones program has come up with to analyze the effects of slavery. And again, that's going to be presented a little later on in the old program here. So After that process is done, after the students engage with these documents, they produce a narrative, kind of a summative piece to really kind of grasp, again, the intimate details of the lives of the enslaved. So when we get around to the idea of having a commemorative witness stone either placed in the area where the enslaved worked, lived, prayed, so on and so forth, that it's a substantive way to inscribe this history on the landscape, in turn, again, reversing this trend that Black history in our built environment, a lot of that has been either systematically or unintentionally eliminated compared to colonial white history. And Dennis referred to the idea of gravestones and burial sites being a great way to at least see that history inscribed on the landscape. That's a hard phrase to get down in one way, and we'll circle back to that in a moment. But as Dennis said, the process of actually researching these lives, even if we've established, one candidate or two candidates to have our kids research, it's a fairly tall task here. And there's a lot of barriers in place that are a little more difficult than your typical or stereotypical way of looking at Ancestry.com and scrolling through maybe your personal genealogical record you see on these commercials. So when it comes to analyzing the lives of the past or finding these likely candidates, Dennis sometimes has more methodological ways to establish who to research or who to look into. Sometimes in talking to Dennis, it seems almost like divine intervention, which is kind of funny, all the circumstances he links together. But I want to be forthright in the way that I've figured out a few candidates for my students to look at, a few specific enslaved people from Hartford for my kids to negotiate in the upcoming 2021 and 2022 school year. The picture on the left-hand side of the screen, Dennis already brought up the Hartford Ancient Burying Ground. There is a really great resource that comes out of Central Connecticut State University, a project done by Dr. Hermes, Catherine Hermes, professor of mine, so I divert to the formal, and her graduate students in creating a resource called Uncovering Their History, an entire digital register of all of the Black and Native American burials in that site. This was a great way for me to look through records and establish a story that would resonate with my students. But Dennis also said this is not the first time that people have tried to reclaim that Black history as it pertains to this ancient burying ground. There's actually a photo on the upper right-hand corner of your screen of 3 students at Fox Middle School with their English teacher, Billy Anthony. This photo is circa like 1996, 1998, of that actual burial plaque they raised the money for through their own research to honor the lives of not only the Black enslaved in the cemetery, but specifically Connecticut Black governors. Now, this is a great example for my students, and in bringing this story and bringing this history to my school, because it shows them that there's students like them, either through examples of different projects that Dennis has done throughout Connecticut and throughout New England, and expanding still regionally. Other students have engaged in this past. Students within their backyard, practically at Hartford, have engaged in this idea of really trying to essentially reclaim and celebrate a Black past that balances this idea of tragedy and triumph, that really shows students that Black history is integral to the American story. It is American history, especially coming from the perspective of working at CREC. If you don't know, we're a magnet school district that was created based on the Sheff versus O'Neill landmark case to address segregation in Connecticut. So a lot of our own mission and vision deals with the idea of equity and equality in instruction. And this program really beautifully dovetails with that, especially allowing our kids to make local connections with, for 50% of our students, they come from Hartford. They have that tie to this space more so than just being bused into a school per se. So this program is really, again, it's lovely. I can't speak high enough of it. It's a missing link in, kind of bringing that CREC institutional mission and vision to my classroom, but additionally making myself a better educator going into my 3rd year next year and trying to link the past and the present for my students. Again, making history tangible while we try to restore that sense of agency to the lives of the enslaved. Next slide. I get to make Dennis my lackey tonight. Shifting at work. Technology is great here. I just want to give you a little bit of insight in which, instead of a single candidate, I decided to pick a family for my students to research and to learn a little bit about in the 2021-2022 school year. This is the Duce-Jennings family. You can see there's 2 different spellings of Ginnings. Again, I just want to remind everyone here, I want to give credit to Dr. Catherine Hermes and her register that Uncovering Their Histories website. A lot of this information does appear in local histories or her website, but it's still a past past that I've tried to essentially transform, make palatable for the students as far as learning activities, and expand upon in research. So the story begins, you've got two names in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, Hannah and Abda. Just to sketch out family relations here, Hannah is Abda's mother. You have Lydia there. She's married to Abda, and the description will flesh this out more for you guys typed. Joseph is the son of Abda and Lydia. Again, Hannah and Abda, the ones that are enslaved. But in order to understand the full depth and complexity of this story, we need to bring Lydia and Joseph into the story. I felt it was pertinent for our students to know that some semblance of familial relations still existed in the North in slavery in spite of Northern slavery. Hannah herself was enslaved at the end of the 17th century, originally to a man called John Richards in Hartford. The Richards family is considered one of the founders of Hartford. You can see it on a founder's stone within that cemetery, the Hartford Ancient Burying Ground, where all four of these figures are buried. Hannah, 1673, was, while still in bondage under John Richards before he passed away, and she was passed on legally to his son, Thomas Richards, through legal channels here. She was raped in 1673 by two white men. That was taken to court. She ascribed parentage to one of them, one who had the last name of Ginnings or Jennings. You can see the two spellings there. And her son Abda was born of that rape. Now, Abda, as he got older and as John Richards passed away, they were passed down to his son, Thomas Richards. And Hannah and Abda both agreed that they were going to essentially leverage Abda's white parentage. He's listed as mulatto in that record, and bring this case to a court of law in the Connecticut colony to try to advocate for Abda's freedom here. The case goes back and forth. It's almost a little hard to negotiate those colonial records, and I'm sure the kids will get a kick out of that next year. But what comes out of it is Abda does secure his freedom. Now, Lydia, his wife, you could see she actually even testifies in court. This is treated even within early local histories from the Reconstruction era as a legislative, blip or a legislative, strange phenomenon here. They use different terms. Joseph, their son, was born free. And again, all of these records paint a story, even though it's, a difficult one to wrestle with, especially with the content of sexual assault for our students. It shows a different angle of learning about agency than you might get from your typical American history textbook. It's a story that allows us, again, to see this past of Hartford slavery through the eyes of the enslaved and not this whitewashed past from the eyes of the enslaver. Next slide. This is cool. I feel so fancy. I want to talk about the idea of agency. I know I mentioned that a lot on our last slide. And agency with this project and trying to bring this to our students comes in two forms here. It comes in the form of, emphasizing agency of the enslaved, but additionally emphasizing the fact that our students take agency in this process of participating in this inquiry-based way to study the past. So this is in keeping with the best of practices for our Connecticut C3 state social studies standards. It is, in every sense of the word, it's like a teacher's dream. It's really, really impressive if you get to dig into it. But agency of the enslaved, again, even just beyond having the students look critically at the idea of Hannah and Abda, leveraging what was, this extremely traumatic event within Hannah's life, her rape, kind of leveraging the idea of white privilege in Abda's own life to secure freedom. That's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to agency. I've got activities for the kids to look at the difference between the accessibility of records between Hannah and Abda. Abda makes it into probate records. There is a review of his final estate. You don't get that with Abda Hannah, because Hannah never was able to be free. She passed away, and that was not an option for her within legislative channels that existed at the time. I additionally have activities for the students to try to, even though you have this success, this sense of triumph of Abda securing his freedom, there's the reality of if you compare Abda's final estate records and his son Joseph's final estate records to, per se, Abda's original slaver, John Richards, his son and grandson's final estate records, you can see that discrepancy of the fact that even though Abda secured his freedom, even though Abda secured a free life for his son Joseph, who was not born into slavery, Connecticut was still not a hospitable place for free Blacks, going all the way up and even past the end of the Civil War. So that's something you still want to have the students recognize, that kind of raw and, gritty story of, even though you have this triumph of Black excellence, which is what we want to impart on the kids, there's also a lot of obstacles that we encounter in American history locally as well. So it's just something, this activity is a good way to have the kids learn early on in the course, since this is our first unit in the year. Reconstruction ties into this, the value of highlighting and, raising up Black voices and honoring that lesson throughout the duration of the year. When it comes to student agency, to shift gears, the nerdy teacher behind the scenes stuff, the tech of how this magic happens, a lot of that student agency comes in the form of, having the kids being able to produce that final narrative of Hannah and Abda's lives, outside of that white enslaver perspective, teaching them to read against the grain and find those, hidden voices in that sense of grassroots history. And that means the students have to work hand in hand, again, with primary and secondary source documents, which is it's a real treat for a social studies classroom. And Dennis gave you the list of all those documents and what they entail. But what it really makes is this non-educator-centric classroom. It allows the students to be put in the driver's seat, and it empowers them to create, again, that trajectory and that path of their final narrative. They additionally get to, place this story into this wider context of what, Hartford slavery is like, and what slavery looks like locally and nationally in the North and abroad throughout the entirety of the nation, showing again how Black history is American history, how those things are synonymous, but historically has not necessarily been treated as the case in teaching American history. It also, again, lets them put this in the context of their school community, not just in terms of, the creation of crack, looking critically at that Shep versus O'Neill case and its legacy. But a lot of our students have come out and told me this year and last year at this school of, they know they have genealogical ties to slavery. They know that they've experienced racism that's come out of slavery, intersectional struggles. This is, again, a really raw opportunity for them to engage with this past and to see that validity in the present. Last slide for me. Last but not least, just in showing you again what this agency entails, Greater Hartford Academy of the Arts, we're an art school. So Dennis is really awesome as far as tailoring this program to specific, schools and districts and local history in terms of what that final outcome can look at. He's given me the leeway to start thinking about, in addition to a narrative, we can have students, express this final portrait of Hannah and Abda's lives through the idea of art. And we've got some examples on the slide of not only an image on the right-hand side that comes from that Uncovering Their History website, meant to be Hannah and Abda, a really beautiful image. But many of you are probably recognizing that Titus Kaffar painting on the left-hand side. An artist, lives in New Haven currently. That piece right there you can see is Sally Hemings juxtaposed with a painting of Thomas Jefferson. So there's examples out there for our kids to work with. And again, trying to reclaim this past that has been put aside in the historical record and has been put aside in the way they've historically negotiated and learned about slavery in Connecticut. So I hope that covers some of the considerations, just a little bit of the tip of the iceberg of what it takes to create this project and think about instituting it in our classroom. But if there's really anything you should walk away with, it's how amazing Dennis and his board and their work is, and what a real treat it is if you ever get the chance. Please consider telling a teacher in your life to partner up with this program. I'm not being paid to say that, but Dennis will give me an A at the end of this. So Dennis, take it away.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. You're too much, we'll just say. But wonderful details and ideas behind, I find all the teachers I work with, including Kaitlyn, bring so much of the project. It really is, it grows with the more teachers and the more students that we have doing it. So we're getting back to, talking about slavery and erasure and disremembering African-American history. So if slavery was critical to the development of our country, if slavery shaped the beliefs about race in our country, if slavery was the main cause of the Civil War, if the enslaved resisted their bonds and still contributed to the growth of our country, how can we remember and restore the history of the enslaved? So this is kind of a big question. How can we do this? And our project started after I'd given a talk about 4 years ago at the Guilford Free Library about my research on local slavery. A friend of mine went to Germany and came back and told us about the Stolperstein, told a group of friends in Guilford about the Stolperstein project. And he said, could we remember the enslaved as they do remember Jews who were where they lived freely before they were kidnapped and murdered under the Holocaust. And I say, if you bring a sore knee to a surgeon, they're going to want to operate. You bring an idea to a middle school student, a teacher, they're going to want to make it a unit. So immediately, I would say within 2 weeks, I was able to kind of visualize how we could take the research that I had, which was just raw wills and probate records and property records and census data and death records, and how I could use it with the kids. But we're inspired by the Stolperstein project. We asked them if they could inspire us, so we made sure that we weren't doing something they didn't want us to do, because their project is so important. There are over 60,000 stones installed in Central Europe. So we knew that, we wanted to get their blessing, I guess is the best way to say it. And our idea was to research enslavement, engage the citizenry, and educate the students. And that's what we've been doing. And we're doing a little bit of that tonight. The Witness Stones mission statement: through research, education, and civic engagement, the Witness Stones project seeks to restore the history and honor the humanity of enslaved individuals who helped build our communities. We were blessed with our friend from West Hartford, Jennifer Frank, wrote an article about us in the summer. She was writing it the summer of 2018, which was really our second summer doing the project, and it ended up in the Teaching Tolerance magazine, and went out to, I think, 40,000 teachers across the country in the winter of spring of 2019. And that's a picture here of Witness Stone memorials being installed in West Hartford. They've done a fantastic job. Denise, Tracy, and Liz, if you're listening, you inspire me every day with the work you do in West Hartford, and we're happy to be able to collaborate with you. So I'll continue. Student activity. How do we teach this to the students? First thing we do is we teach the teachers about the West India trade, about Connecticut and slavery. I went through public schools in New England and private university to get my master's degree, and I didn't learn about this stuff. So how do we do this? Well, we try to teach the teachers about the history that they hadn't been taught, and in a way that allows them to feel confident in being able to teach it to the students. And then we looking at my research, I developed these 5 recurring themes: dehumanization, the treatment of enslaved, paternalism, economics of slavery and freedom, and human agency and resistance. If I had to balance which one's the most important, it's certainly human agency and resistance, but it doesn't make sense. Human agency and resistance doesn't make sense. The achievements of the enslaved make sense only when you realize how they were torn down and how they were dehumanized to show what things they did in their own lives. And we just heard the story of some people fighting for their freedom in courts that probably weren't really friendly for people of color at that time. We teach these kids this through a jigsaw activity. If you're an educator, you know that you would have one group of students. If you had 25 kids in your class, 5 of them would become experts on dehumanization, 5 would become experts on economics, 5 would become experts on human agency and resistance, and then they would teach it to each other. And I was just mentioning before to my friends who are running the show, I said I spent my day rebooting my jigsaw activity for the students for the remainder of this year, and I'm trying to make it better, more accessible to the students and teachers every day. We have to take these documents, find them first, which is a big challenge, read them, which is also a big challenge, transcribe them, and then pre-digest them, I guess is a way of, I like to say it, I don't know if people like the image, but if you take a 4-page will that's written by hand in 1720, there's some work you have to do before you get it in the hands of a 13 or 14 or 16-year-old student. How can we do this? We can show dehumanization with a bill of sale. Here's Tamar being sold, but then on the right we see this very interesting story that it appears her agency was getting married. She married Venture Smith's son Solomon, and as we continue to do research on Tamar with my friends in Suffield, this was an adult activity. We found that she had other agency because probably about 10 years after she married Solomon, it looks like she ran away from him, and he put an ad in the paper. So she showed agency both while she was enslaved and when she was freed. So we don't know what their relationship was. I don't want to talk bad about Solomon, but Tamar was able to escape freedom and escape marriage. So she had stuff going for her. Of course, as soon as we made this, we found out this wasn't a proper end date. So we're going to fix that. We're fixing that as we speak. Treatment of the enslaved in the North, as told by white owners, they were treated leniently, with many freedoms, paternalism with masters guiding the morals of slaves, and they were treated as part of this family. If we look at what enslaved people, we have 3 people who wrote their narratives in Connecticut who were enslaved in Connecticut: Venture Smith, James Mars, and Jeffrey Brace. And they talk about whippings, beatings, and hog tying, double crossing and cheating, abandonment of the aged, youth sold south, severe punishments for minor crimes. So this is what enslaved people and people of color speak of, versus what maybe a Lyman Beecher spoke about. Oh, slavery was nice. It was good slavery. Well, anyway, there's no such thing as good slavery, so please don't quote me on that. What is human agency? Human agency could be refusing to work, sabotaging work, or running away. But other forms of agency could be working hard to gain the goodwill of your enslaver who wants to free you, earning money and paying for your freedom, having children, and even when someone doesn't want you to have children, or surviving captivity. We don't judge whether working hard as a slave person to gain your freedom is better or worse than running away. We just know that we see people making choices to be able to get their freedom or change their life or get back at somebody who's treated them poorly. In the middle we see a runaway ad. This was from the Current, and it has, if I remember correct, I think this is in the Norwalk area, but we could see these runaway ads. There's hundreds of them for Connecticut. I don't think I'm exaggerating there. Showing agencies through past and present success. We see here, Lyman Beecher talks about this man named Moses, who was a king of the slaves in the Guilford area. He was also a factotum. He also sent his enslaver's son to Yale. He paid for his tuition. Well, Moses' fourth great nephew was Lieutenant Colonel Bertram Wadsworth Wilson, who worked at Yukon and retired up in Ashford. He was a Tuskegee Airman. Pat Wilson Phineas, who was recently a state representative from Ashford, is now the co-chair of the Witness Stones Project. So we can see that just like our grandparents and great-grandparents who sacrificed for us, we can see family stories where enslaved people oftentimes sacrifice for the next generation to allow for their successes later. We provide teacher workshops, and I talked a little bit about that. I also work with historical organizations where we'll be putting 2 stones at the Pardee Morris House out in Morris Cove, and this is the slave quarters on the upper left-hand corner at the Bush Hawley House in Greenwich, Connecticut. We're working with historical societies in Killingly, Norfolk, Salisbury, Old Lyme, and other locations throughout Connecticut to try to bring these stories. And we also are working with a African American museum in central New Jersey, as well as historic Deerfield. Black lives have always mattered. Here's that list of places. I think I'm gonna speed up a little bit, but you can see how we're spreading across the state of Connecticut, and we're going to continue to spread this project. We have a great installation May 1st up in Norfolk at the Congregational Church for James Morris, who we have, his narrative is extant. But we're continuing to spread the project. We have to be invited. We don't bring it to communities. Communities invite us in, and that's how it works the best. This is a nice story we have here. Latouche, this was in Madison. She was freed twice. I've now found the 4th person who was freed twice because of the way the economics of slavery, and it benefited the enslaver to free their enslaved persons after 1792, so they wouldn't be responsible for them in their old age. So that happened to Latouche, but you can see, we have these learning outcomes. As Kaitlyn was talking, they become consumers and producers of information literacy, collaborate, communicate, present individual shared understandings, and build the foundation to discuss the hard history on the path towards truth and reconciliation. the biggest learning I've gotten from this project myself is when I was a kid or adult, I used to blame the South for slavery. I used to blame the South for racism. I used to blame the South for segregation and inequality. And knowing that it was here, and in some cases started here, helps us understand our history, but also helps us understand our responsibility to make the changes here to reconcile with the past. So, and if you want to learn about our project, donate to our project. We're mostly fee for service, but we could use donations and help. And if you want to contact me, all that information's on the bottom, dennis@witnessstonesproject.org, or just click on our Witness Stones Project site. You can see some of our work, you can see our philosophy, and you can see some of the places we've been doing our job. So I think I'm done for now. So should I stop the sharing?
Yep, I'm here to ask a couple questions. Thanks so much to both of you. That was so interesting. I learned so much in just a short 45 minutes. And I have some questions written down, but I'd like to go to the questions in the comments first. We do have a couple, and they're really good. So Mariana asks, what advice would you give to students who are frustrated with large information gaps and are feeling stuck in their research?
I think it's going to finding these books and finding these places. Marianne, if you want to email me, I've developed a kind of a bibliography or works cited of New England slavery. And I think, what I've always done is I read a book and then I look in the works cited and I get the next book and I get the next book. A lot of places are doing very good work right now with giving presentations and bringing in experts in these fields. So, keep your eyes open and ears open, but also just start, look at the book Complicity, maybe look at the book Dark Work by Christy Clark Pujara, and you'll see them referencing other books that'll help you bring these stories closer together.
Kaitlyn, do you have anything to add?
What helped me most is not being afraid to look for parallel stories, is the way Dennis framed it. So a lot of times, Dennis already said, there's sometimes where all you know about these people or all you can know about the enslaved is just the names that they left behind. So knowing even the smallest bit of circumstance and being able to at least find a story that might match the trajectory of their life, you're still getting the essence of regional slavery. So I think explaining to them that this kind of research is, again, completely different than stereotypical, genealogical research you see on Ancestry or you see on these commercials and you just click, resource that comes to you. Having them break out of that understanding, that helped me the most, trying to change my mindset on what this research looked like. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a good question.
Yeah, it was a really good question. We have another question from Cleo, who asks, do you provide workshops for churches interested in genealogy?
I give presentations to churches, and I don't. I'm not a genealogist. There are people. There is a Connecticut Genealogical Society, and there's also an African American Genealogical nationwide society that there's a New England branch to, and I'd happy to reference you to those groups. But I talk about my research, but I don't teach genealogy, I guess is the best way to say it. I'm hoping to bring on additional interns and maybe some staff later on so I can teach somebody else what we're doing. But I'm happy to, come visit virtually or to a church and answer questions and show how I find information.
Cool, thank you. Now, if anyone has any other questions, please leave them in the comments. We've got a little bit more time, but I'm going to ask one of mine. What aspect of the history of slavery in Connecticut tends to interest the students most?
I think, and I was just talking to a teacher about this, and they have a sense of fairness, which is very elevated. So a student always knows if, another student's getting an advantage or a disadvantage, or the teacher's being nice to one person on another. Well, when they read that in the record, when they see something in the record, that pops out to them. And the students also bring more emotion to the stories than I think I do. I read these and I read them again, and I get very excited when I find certain aspects. I'm beginning to find this relationship between enslaved and free people from Connecticut going to Vermont, and it isn't something I was looking for, but all of a sudden I'm finding it. But the kids, they see things. So when we were doing the story of Latouche and Madison, those kids saw Latouche. They saw the record where she lost a couple children very young in the church records. And then they saw that when she ended up in the poorhouse, they took her children, they bound them out to other people. And when we were going to write the plaque or develop the plaque for Latouche, all they could imagine her as a mother. And I sat back and said, well, we want to talk about if she, was a weaver or a spinner or maybe a farmer. And for them, they humanized, they restored her humanity so much, they were comparing her to their own mother. What would my mother have done if her children were taken from her? And so the kids can sometimes use their feelings and emotions in a way that, maybe older folks can, or maybe people of color can more because it's their story. Pat Wilson-Phineas, who's on our board, she's a 9th generation descendant of enslaved people in Connecticut. She brings to our board and she brings to the project a perspective that I can't. But I'll tell you, those kids, they bring a perspective of emotion that is very strong. And I think something as jarring as seeing people listed without their names or people listed as pieces of property beside livestock and other items in a barn, that's powerful for them. And they remember that.
I never know when to jump in. Just to pick off of what Dennis said, and that was a really, really great response. Obviously, I still need to institute this project formally in my own classroom, but when I have introduced this past year and the year prior, the idea of slavery even existing in Connecticut, obviously, as Dennis said, this is usually a hidden history or a more so hidden history. Students are surprised to kind of have that image of Connecticut change in their heads. And additionally, this generation of students especially, even though I'm somewhat in that generation, I'm closer in age to the kids, they are so much more well-read as far as current issues as when I was, going through high school. They're really apt to make that connection to the present as far as inequality that they see in Connecticut over time. And then something that grabs them and interests them the most is that way that, again, it's a still applicable story, especially as we're, knee-deep in our current civil rights movement. So it's something that sticks out to me as a newer educator. Dennis is the experienced, hat here.
That's really great. It's interesting that makes a lot of sense. I see the same thing or have heard the same thing, that students today are the most sort of active in these types of things in a present day context as they've ever been. Let's see, what's another, we don't have a lot of time left, so I want to ask the really good questions. Do you have advice for institutions who are named after slaveholders on how to look critically at their namesakes and move forward? Dennis, I know you talked a little bit about the street names being a good example of a good response to maybe having a negative namesake. Do you have anything else to elaborate with that?
I'll say that's an interesting idea and a moving target in so many ways. We remember, hopefully we know that Jefferson and Washington were enslavers, but we also remember them for the service of their country. And someone like John C. Calhoun, I know Yale had issues. They had a college named after him. He was known especially for defending slavery and creating lies around slavery to extend the institution. So if you were to sit there and say, I need to change the name of something, it took a little bit of time, but it made sense for Yale to change the name of John C. Calhoun. I drive through some towns and my poor wife sits next to me and I said, oh, that street's named after an enslaver and that street's named after an enslaver. Oh, that family, they're enslavers too. And, the Hemingway family in East Haven, they were enslaved. And, you'd almost, in some towns, have to change about half the signs of your streets. So the question then becomes, were these people remembered because of that being enslavers, or was there some other contribution? Luckily, I don't have to be a judge in that decision. It's hard. It takes, things take time. Our local school changed the name of their mascot from the Indians to the Grizzlies, the Guilford Grizzlies, and it took time. And people have to be ready. Even our greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, didn't issue the Emancipation the moment he was elected. He had to wait to the right time. So I'm not saying you don't want to change names, but there's probably 24 names of streets in Hartford that could be changed right now, or buildings, because they're associated with enslavers, or the last names associated with the enslavers. So you kind of have to work backwards and say, what would be the purpose of that? And should we change Washington Avenue because George Washington held people in captivity? I don't know the answer to that. I just know it's challenging. And a community has to be involved with that decision. It shouldn't be done from the outside, although I think some states now are telling their high schools that there'll be no mascots named after Indigenous people or after any people, something like that. So it's changing, but I'm happy not to be the one doing it because people aren't happy at the end of it. I'll just say that. At the end, it's not like everybody said, oh, that's a good idea to change the name of the high school mascot. It really wasn't. And so how do we, maybe there's a way of getting there where more people are in agreement.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely is a complicated issue, and people very often don't like change. So we have time for one more question, and I know it's kind of a broad question, but I think it's a good way to close out the program. And both of you can answer. What is your dream for the Witness Stones project?
My board keeps asking me that question. I think, in some ways we're living the dream. We'll be putting in our 70th stone by June 19th this year, and that stone will be placed in Suffield. I am, from when we started with my friend coming back from Germany to where we are now is living the dream we have. But our goal is really to teach more teachers and engage more students with our curriculum, and to tell the hard history. My other dream is that our students will be better prepared to deal with what we're dealing with today. Black Lives Matter didn't start in 2014. It started in it started, it didn't start until 2021. It started in 1721, or, maybe 1619, or in Connecticut in 1635. We have to go backwards. We have to tell the truth before we can reconcile where we are. So not only is my dream that we continue to spread this, but that we get this, Dr. Fauci was talking about herd immunity, but we get it so that enough Americans understand the past that our decisions moving forward make sense to have a more equal and just society. So how can we get enough people understanding the past to say we need to change the present to affect the future? So that sounds kind of, maybe there is a dream, but we'll get there.
My dream just coming up for the 2021-2022 school year, when I officially, pilot this lesson, this program, and crack, is just to have the students be able to physically vocalize that linkage between why is it important to inscribe this history on the landscape, and what are the connections between history and memory, the past and the present. And again, our current civil rights movement, as Dennis was, really beautifully saying there, I really hope that it takes off within my district. They're really big fans of it already. And again, I hope this is something that sticks with the students for generations to come. And it's not, well, generations is a little bit melodramatic, I'll say, but sticks with them as this long lasting impression of this was a meaningful way to look at Connecticut slavery. And this didn't fall into, tropes that educators have of a lot of history teachers isolate Black history and don't show again that it's integral to American story. I hope this, and I know based on what Dennis has said of his other programs, that this will stick with the students. I'm just excited to see that outcome. And I know our rising class of juniors and seniors are going to really enjoy it. So that's my dream.
Thank you both so much. I'm just going to take a quick moment before we close out to do two things. One, I mentioned in the comments, please fill out our post-program survey to let us know what you thought of the program and suggest other programs that might be of interest to you. I also just want to take a minute to share our upcoming programs. So next Thursday, we have a Conversations at noon, Out of the Shadows, Hartford's First Black Church in School. That'll be a conversation with Jeff Partridge from Capital Community College. And that same evening, there's an Encounters program. I believe this one is facilitated by the Wadsworth called City Beautiful. And then we've got a couple of programs coming up in May and June. On Tuesday, May 18th, we've got a discussion on historic preservation and diversity with Roan O'Hara, Mary Falvey, Jane Montanero, and Jonathan Kinney for a panel discussion about how to ensure preservation efforts are representative of our state's diverse communities and are not limited to a wealthy few. So if you liked tonight's program, I think you'll really like that one as well. And then we have a conversation in June on Wednesday, June 16th, People Preserving Connecticut's Past discussion with the new state librarian and our state archaeologist. So we've got Carolyn says, thank you. Pamela says, great job, Kaitlyn. This was so exciting and interesting, and I really enjoyed speaking with you both. And Dennis, you want to just plug Witness Stones one more time, share that website?
Sure. It's witnessstonesproject.org, and there's 3 S's in the middle. So if you don't get us, or you can Google us, we show up pretty quickly. And I'm Dennis at Witness Stones Project. Thank you for putting that in there, Allison. And yeah, Dennis at witnessstonesproject.org. And either way, I'd love to, engage people with the project. And if you need more information or if you want to bring it to your school district, just let me know.
All right. Thank you so much to both of you.
Thanks.
I hope, everyone has a good evening. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Allison. And thank you, Kaitlyn, for all those kind words.
Oh, thank you, Dennis.
Bye-bye.